Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline, and I'm on the research paper team for the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Jensen and Bettina Cornwell. They're going to be presenting their paper, Why Do Marketing Partnerships End? Evidence from Global Sports Sponsorships. They'll do a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you for being here. I know that you have choice and you decided to be here. I appreciate that. I'm Bettina Cornwell, and my co-author is Jonathan Jensen, and we'll be talking about why marketing partnerships end. I'd like to say that Jonathan came to me 2 years ago and said, I think we can model this and learn how partnerships, big partnerships end. What do you think? And I was like, I'm in. And so here we are 2 years later, and happy to be with you today. So let me start by saying that many sponsorships, unfortunately, are a bit more transaction-based. And what we know about sponsorship relationships between a sport and a brand are that the longer they last, the more they deliver benefits. Empirically, we're starting to see information about that, and intuitively, it's there. It works for advertising. Longer advertising campaigns outpull short campaigns. However, these are relationships, not purchased advertising. Excuse me. So looking at it from a relationship perspective, a partnership, it's a different sort of thing than buying advertising. And it starts with commitment, and it starts with trust. And looking at that as a framework, we have to say, it's more than just that. As my grandmothers used to say about marriages, there's no romance without finance. So there's some financial decision-making, there's decision-making on both sides, and also there are economic conditions surrounding a partnership. So we're looking at very, very big partnerships in this particular data set, but it does apply to smaller relationships as well. And we're trying to model a holistic package of variables in one model that help us to understand how the sponsorships continue or how they end. So moving beyond simply trust and commitment, we envision three, if you will, buckets of variables. The first bucket of variables are variables that concern both parts of the party, the sponsor and the sport property. The second package is the seller-related or the sport property variables that are important in the deal. The sport property is the seller, and the customer is the buyer or the investor, and that is our brand, our sponsor. Unpackaging each one of these then, in terms of the dyadic, we have environmental conditions. We have economic conditions that influence the relationship. So when we talk about those, we're talking about growth, we're talking about inflation, the overall economic context. Especially influential there is the economic context for the sponsor's market. We also are talking about big picture relationship aspects. For example, was there an opportunistic coming together of a sport and a sport property and a sponsor, an opportunistic or a relationship that has some agency effects, so individuals making decisions or thinking about themselves individually rather than thinking about the overall organization and this relationship's health. Because if they were thinking individually, agency effects apply, then we can imagine that the partnership would not last as long. The second bucket of variables are seller or property related. And while there are several in there, let me just highlight two. So the property makes the decision in this data set. We're looking at World Cup and we're looking at the Olympics. So the property makes the decision about where these events will unfold, the host city. In making that decision, they make decisions about the population and its buying power, about the economics surrounding those markets, how large the market is. And so they make decisions that contribute to the potential health of the relationship and its longevity. The seller also makes decisions around the number of sponsors that will be brought into the relationship. So the sport property says we're going to have the top program in Olympics and only have 10 or 12, 11. And we all have been in one of those races or done something in sport where you had like 150, sponsors on the back. And we know it doesn't work very well in communicating anything about the sponsor. So those kinds of decisions to have a great number of relationships on the part of the sport property might be damaging and contribute to clutter. And we know that clutter doesn't help us. Empirically, we already understand this, that the more sponsors are involved, the less chance any one of them has to communicate clearly. The third bucket of variables are customer-related or the sponsor variables. And here we have a number of things, but let me highlight the fact that their congruence with the sport, the sponsor's congruence with the sport, is established as being important. Running event, running shoe works quite differently than running event an insurance company. When those two come together, there are different things that need to be done to make it successful. As well, we have a number of different variables that are related to that sponsor and what they do, their leadership, the longevity of their leadership, the turnover, the stability of that company. In that this is a model that's attempting to be comprehensive and holistic, we also have a goodly number of control variables. For example, if a company is privately held or publicly held, if the company is B2B, B2C, and the level of sponsorship. So how invested are they? The sponsorships in our data set come from, again, World Cup and Olympics. And as you can see over the history of these partnerships, we have a great number of large companies represented. All right, that's all from me, and Jonathan will take over.
Thank you, Dr. Cornwell. So what methodology are we using to empirically predict whether a partnership continues or ends? It's called survival analysis modeling. You see the icon there. It comes from the biostatistics field, and what biostatisticians typically do is use this modeling approach to determine whether the covariates in the model are either increasing or decreasing the probability that the patient will die. We're applying this methodology to our world of sports marketing to determine whether the partnership lives or dies. Specifically, what we do in this modeling approach is we model a hazard function, is what it's called. And again, it's kind of the conditional probability of an event occurring, either increases or decreases the probability of that happening. And again, our event occurrence of interest is the end of the partnership rather than the end of the patient. So it's just an interesting approach where you can take a methodology that's used in other fields and apply it to sports analytics, which is not different from what a lot of us are doing here. So this is kind of a glimpse of our kind of full model. The table is in the paper, so you can take a look at it. And I'm going to speak about each of the 4 variables that we found were statistically significant predictors of sponsorship dissolution. But I'll just point out a couple of things on this table. If you take a look at the Wald test down at the bottom, so each of our groups of factors that Dr. Cornwell talked about are each predicting a significant amount of the incremental variance in sponsorship dissolution. And I think that provides some empirical evidence that what we have here is a pretty dynamic, it's an integrated model, but it's very dynamic, and it's kind of proving for the first time in the sports marketing literature that it's not just the brand that makes this decision, that there's external factors and there's also decisions made by the seller that influence decision making. And then I'll point out down there at the bottom the AIC, which assesses which model is the best fit. Lower is better. So you see our last model there that has 14 different variables in it was actually the best fitting model. It also takes into account how parsimonious the model is. So you always want your kind of last model to be the best fitting. So that's a good sign as well. So talking specifically about some individual variables, Dr. Cornwell mentioned economic conditions. So what we found is the presence of an inflationary economy in the home country of the sponsor. Think about it. Inflation is measured by the Consumer Price Index. Prices of all goods and services are rising in that market, but the budget for the marketer might not be rising to reflect that. So what we found is for every 1% increase in the average annual growth rate of the Consumer Price Index in the home country of the sponsor, it increases the probability of the sponsorship ending by 33.1%. And that's a statistically significant finding there. So that to me, again, is really interesting. But moving forward, you need to kind of monitor economic conditions, for both sides of the relationship. The next one is one of our seller-related factors, clutter. Dr. Cornwell mentioned the number of sponsors that are part of, in this case, which is supposed to be a global exclusive group of sponsors. For every one additional sponsor the property adds, it increases the probability that the sponsorship is going to end by 49.6%. We'll talk in a minute about kind of the consequences and implications of that. And then a couple of brand-related variables. Congruence or fit. Think about Adidas sponsoring the World Cup. It's an obvious match, and they're endemic to the sport. So if the brand is congruent with the property, it decreases the probability of the sponsorship ending by 69.3%. And then finally, brand equity. We measured this based on the brand's presence in Interbrand's list of the top 100 brands in the world. So if a brand has high brand equity, think Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Samsung, it decreases the probability of the sponsorship ending by 68.2%. These are some updated numbers because we've added some more variables since we first posted the paper, so you're seeing the latest information. I think my hypothesis here is that high brand equity sponsors view sponsorship as more of a long-term brand building activity, whereas other sponsors where they look at it more as a transactional exchange. Maybe they're providing computers to the property, and it's kind of a give and take. The brand-building sponsors like the Coca-Colas of the world see sponsorship as a long-term partnership that's going to elevate our brand over time. So I think they're just more patient, and they're more likely to stick around. But I thought that was interesting. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the implications of this research. So what this slide is depicting here is the number of sponsors who will stay after 12 years, which is 3 renewal cycles in the instance of the Olympics and World Cup, which is based on quadrennials or 4-year partnerships. So what you have on the bottom there are the number of sponsors. Now, the IOC, International Olympic Committee, just recently went from a 12-sponsor model to a 13-sponsor model when they added Alibaba out of China. And we added some predicted values into our final model. And what it tells us actually is even when you take into account the additional revenue that the property is going to receive based on that incremental sponsor, it's going to decrease the durations of all of the other sponsors, and it's actually going to end up being a losing proposition. When you plug those numbers in the model, we predict, and our model predicts, that that decision by the IOC is going to cost them $95 million a year based on the durations of all of the other sponsors. You can see pretty quickly the World Cup currently has a 14-sponsor model, and you could see how if there were to increase and let in more sponsors, it's simply going to increase the probability that all those other sponsorships are going to end. And then for you guys that like graphs, I'll just show you a couple of kind of differentials. This is that hazard function that I talked about over time, and you see how the hazard function is kind of steadily increasing over time. The one on the left is the congruence. So you see how much higher the hazard function is for incongruent sponsors versus congruent sponsors. And it starts out, maybe only about 10 to 15% difference, meaning there's about a 10 or 15% higher probability that those sponsorships are going to end, but it gets even, the disparity gets even greater over time. And then on the right there is looking at high brand equity sponsors versus low brand equity sponsors. So it's just, if you like visuals and you like to look at things graphically, you can just see the difference in the hazard function between these two brand-related variables. So what else are we working on? This data set are global sponsorships of the Olympics and World Cup. So there's some things that we couldn't assess. For example, we can't look at how the performance of the property itself influences sponsorship duration. So we've been working on a data set of English Premier League shirt sponsorships dating back to 1992. With that data set, for example, we're going to look at, well, does how the team performs and whether it's promoted or relegated, how does that impact whether sponsors stick around or not? We also weren't able to assess costs with this model in terms of how much exactly the sponsors are paying. And we have another data set of apparel sponsorships where we have the contracts and we know exactly how much the sponsors are paying. So we can look at the impact of rising costs over time. The great thing about this research in my mind is that every sponsorship has a beginning and an end. So this is something we can apply across a great deal of different contexts and all sponsors, whether they're publicly traded or privately owned. And our modeling approach, the survival analysis methodology, is robust enough to handle both sponsorships that have ended and also what we call censored observations, sponsorships that are continuing to this day. So it literally can be applied to any context. So we've got several other contexts like naming rights sponsorships and bold title sponsorships that we're looking at. And the plan here, ideally, is that we're going to create this kind of meta-analysis of a great deal of different sponsorship contexts and really help to understand both sides of this relationship, why these sponsorships continue or end so that they can kind of constantly be monitored throughout the life of the relationship. This is our information. Hit us up on Twitter. If you have any other suggestions on other variables or contexts that we can investigate, we'd love to hear about them moving forward. And we'll take questions now. Thanks. Dr. Cornwell, you want to go?
Hi, thank you. I actually work for an NHL team, and across the league, we have league sponsors. So we're required to, commit X amount of different assets, whether in-game, online, et cetera. Have you looked into the differences between those kind of sponsorships versus the team-based sponsorships? So we have a lot of local sponsors that we're trying to show some love to all the time, but we also have our league commitments. So I'm just interested to see what the difference is there. I mean, it's kind of a different dynamic, but we do have responsibilities across, multiple different channels for them. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mention it, but we are developing a database of official status sponsorships. Dr. Cornwell did a paper in the past looking at how those types of sponsorships impact stock prices. And I think it would be very interesting to compare those results to the local team partnerships and also maybe look at an interaction effect between the league sponsors that support the local teams. Some brands just choose to do league-wide sponsorships and leave it at that. Others take a more local approach, and it'd be interesting to look at kind of the dynamics of both of those. So absolutely, I think that's this research can absolutely be applied to that context, and we're working on that.
Hi, have you guys considered looking at this with the sponsors, especially the large multinational companies like Coca-Cola, being the principal agents making the decisions about who they want to sponsor based on performance, and looking at that as the main agent versus sort of the mutuality or the Olympics being the sort of locus for investigation?
I'm not sure I completely understand. Our model is dynamic in that we're looking at variables that relate to both sides of the relationship. I think what you're getting at is, we are looking at other contexts. This is the Olympics and World Cup, but we hope to expand it to other contexts. But I'm not sure I exactly get where you're headed.
Does it give you a way to look at decision-making for a brand or a company in terms of figuring out for itself which sponsorships are the most very valuable and which they want to maintain?
The sponsorship selection.
Yeah.
Could it help with that?
Yeah.
It's looking currently back in time and what resulted in dissolution. So it's not a forward-looking model in that sense, but once you learn from a backward-looking model, you can make forward-looking decisions better.
Hi.
Hard to see.
Here.
There.
I was about to go hello. You're looking at very geographically specific events, so what effect does geography have? Because you've got FIFA World Cup in different continents, you've got the Olympics in different continents. How does that affect sponsor drop-off? And secondly, as somebody who runs events, what's the magic number of mainline sponsors you should have for long-term sustainability?
I don't know that we've identified a magic number of sponsors yet. This is a predictive model, so we can plug in all sorts of numbers into it. I think on that slide I showed, we just looked at kind of 12 to 16 sponsors because that's kind of been the typical model. But you're right, it might be possible to look at a smaller number of sponsors is better, is what we're finding. But perhaps I think what you're suggesting is maybe plug some lower numbers into the model and see and take into account how much the sponsors are paying and look at when you hit that tipping point of where you're not going to have enough revenue to support or kind of revenue based on what you've received in the past. So I think that's a great suggestion. I'm going to look at that for sure.
But your geography question was, how does it account for the various markets? Yeah. So the markets are in there, and I think that's what's beautiful about this model is it does include the influence of the various markets in terms of both where the sponsor's located and where the event's located.
Yeah, we looked at the population in the market, the wealth of the people in that market, whether the market is the same as the sponsorship decision maker. That's all in the model. There was no significance there. We didn't find anything specific to that particular market except for the economic conditions that were significant, so we didn't really cover it. But I think our take on that is that these are two global contexts that, where the events move every 4 years, so decisions are made kind of in a global context and not related to where the event be held. It'll be interesting with the next 3 Olympics happening in Asia, in Japan, South Korea, and China, whether once those events have taken place, whether some sponsors in the Asian continent like Toyota and Bridgestone, whether they'll exit, but we won't know that until that happens. But we did look at kind of the local market and how that might impact it.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Thanks so much. I just had a quick question for you regarding any investigation you've done in the underlying assets comprising some of these deals. Were they varied across the different partners, working with these two committees? And did that have any effect on the success of the partnership?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's kind of one reason why we chose this data set to begin with, that the assets that they receive are very similar across the different brands, so it kind of controls for that. But you're absolutely right. We want to look at more context where sponsors are receiving different assets. For example, all of these sponsors are exclusive in their product category, so we weren't really able to parse out how exclusivity might impact it. But that's a great question. We will
with Japan.
Right, absolutely. So when we move forward, we'll look at how the an asset, for example, like exclusivity or official status designation might impact it. With this data set, I think it kind of controlled for that moving forward. But that's what's so exciting about this research is it can be applied to so many different contexts, and we look forward to kind of investigating some of those other things.
Perfect. So let's give a big round of applause for Bettina and Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.